Okay, let me answer the second part twice. It's very similar to what we were going to do. This place was called Fra Mauro. It was rougher than Apollo 11, for instance, which was in the Sea of Tranquility. And it was very flat. Had some boulders on it, but it was flat. Where these guys were going to land on 13, where we did land on 14, was pretty rugged. And that's what the geologists love. They love the rugged country, just like they do when they do geology research here on Earth. Yeah, we trained as a unit. The gold team, for instance, each team in Mission Control took a color. It was just easier to mention the gold team's on for this, the blue team's on for that, etc. Rather than saying, well, Gerry Griffin's team is going to do this, we just use color. The gold team changed a little bit from mission to mission. And in particular in the Capcom area, because there were times when we either wanted the prime or the backup crew or the support crew on because they specialized in certain areas. But on 14, we had this guy that had trained to land at this place and do all the tasks that 14 did. So it was great to have Fred on board because he could anticipate the questions almost. And a lot of times during the EVAs, we call them EVAs, I really liked those are extravehicular activity. Indeed, they were EVAs. I like to call them excursions because they were excursions from the home base, which in that case was the lunar module, but they were doing things. They weren't in 0G, they were in 16G, and it was different. They were working in a way that kind of free work. And they could, as Fred says, they could go off on their own because they were trained to look for certain patterns in samples that could be on the ground. So we were pretty quiet in mission control during that period. We had to talk to the mothership because these guys still had, they would have had Swigert, but in this case we had Russo. Stu Russo on 14 was in the mothership. So we kind of set up a separate comm loop with that guy back in lunar orbit. That's the mothership that's going to get us home. So he was still important. We really paid close attention to their backpack. We had instrumentation on their backpack. They had some too, but we had more. So their backpack was in that suit. They were like a spacecraft, a little bitty spacecraft. It was just housing them. So that was their key to life. So we really watched those closely, and we had a lot of chatter inside the control center, but we didn't talk to them a lot about it because we didn't have to. Those little backpacks worked wonders. So it was you trained as a unit. One of the things I mentioned to some people here at lunch, and I can't remember which group it was because it was stupid. Anyway, one of the things that I was amazed at the 1960s and 1970s that we were able to do was the simulations were as high fidelity as they were. We had for instance, doing launch simulations, we would have a crew in the simulator at the Cape. We wired data, transmitted data into the control center in Houston. To us, it looked just like a real flight. And we could run eight launches a day because we debriefed every one of them. We did that with all the simulations. They were very, very realistic. We never simulated what we had to do on 13. But we had talked about using the lunar module as a lifeboat. We had gotten that far. And said if we ever had to, we could rely on it. But remember, if they had gone down and landed, and here's Swigert still in orbit, and he had stirred the tanks there and had the explosion. We were probably done for. It was over. Because we had to have the lunar module, we needed that descent staging, which is left on the moon. The ascent stage comes off. The descent stage had these huge batteries. Those were 250 amp hours, 750 amp hours each, I think. Four of them, and they were big. That was the power that really got us home. And so we would have not had that power available to us, and no fuel cells to produce power in the command service module. So it would have been curtains. And so we were very fortunate that the accident, the tank blew when it did, and allowed us to get home.
All right, so let's go back to the explosion now. Fred, would you take us into the spacecraft? Tell us what was going on at the time of the explosion, and then take us through what your reactions were and getting back into your family.
Well, what I was doing was putting away equipment and things we had pulled out for a TV show, which I think was shown. I wasn't watching, but part of that was shown on the screen here. If we had had the cryo stir 30 minutes earlier, we would have had the explosion while we were on live TV. Because we were doing a live TV show. It's kind of like show and tell you do it in school. We were showing objects and talking about things in the limb we pulled out that we knew from reviewing TV shows from previous missions had never been talked about. So we wanted a new subject. And I was busy putting that stuff back away that I pulled out, and an explosion happened. Jim was not yet quite left the limb. He was on his way back up to go through the tunnel back to the capsule. So Jack was up there all alone when this happened. And he made that first call. Houston, we had a problem here. And Jim got up there, and Mission Control had not answered. I think with the explosion, when that panel blew off, it hit the antenna, the high gain antenna. Briefly, we had lost comm there. And we got comm back on the little 4 Omni antennas that were around the sides of the service module. Get comm back, Jim repeated the call. Now, when I then quickly drifted through, up through the tunnel, and incidentally, I knew it was bad, not only the large bang of the metallic hull echoing the sound, like kind of like you're in a big tin can and somebody hits on it with a sledgehammer. But also noticeably was a little 100-pound attitude thrusters were firing sporadically, trying to hold the vehicle attitude, because when that huge 1/4 of the service module blew off, that panel, it put a impetus motion to the combined spacecraft, and those little jets were trying to hold our attitude when that happened. And there was also some, behind that, some motion and that caused an internal, as I then started through, a rippling in the tunnel walls. Like you squeeze a tin can of Coke or something and sprinkle the sides. There's a little metal sprinkling in the tunnel from the torches put into the two vehicles that were connected through that tunnel area. But anyway, nothing came apart, and I made it up to my position in the right couch position. And I've already talked about the oxygen tank. The other most confusing thing was the number of lights on. We had 7 caution and warning lights on. It's an array about that big of lights, some red, which means something bad, and some orangish, yellowish, that means caution, that means not quite as bad. So we had 7 of those lights on, and they were in different systems that had no connection to each other. So that was really confusing, because there was no way you could have 5 or 6 failures all at once in different systems. It turned out it wasn't failures. The G shock of the explosion had overcome the spring tension on some of the gaseous and liquid system valves, and they were open, and it overcame the spring tension and closed those valves. that weren't supposed to be closed. Now, we had no indication of that on our panel. Now, Mission Control had telemetry and eventually asked Jack to recycle some of those controls, and those lights went away. So it really only had the one major problem of the loss of the single oxygen tank. But there was a little confusion factor there for a while. From there we went into troubleshooting. Where again, Mission Control was trying to figure out how to stop the leak in the second tank. And it got pretty desperate. We were down to cutting reaction valves on fuel cells, thinking of, and we lost 2 of the 3 fuel cells immediately from the shock of the explosion. It closed the reactant valves. And then we had no way of restarting those fuel cells then. Some-day shuttles, you could restart fuel cells, but we couldn't. So anyway, we were down to 1 fuel cell, and that went on for 50-something minutes, troubleshooting, different schemes of cycling valves and changing the configuration to try to stop that leak. It was about that same time that we collectively run out of any ideas. And so Jim and I were scurried to go power up the balloon motor. And it was, we went through it hurriedly with Jack Lausma was on the line as a Capcom. Jack flew the second Skylab mission. He was on the console as Capcom at the time. And I knew, obviously I knew we weren't going to need radars, rendezvous radar, landing radar, which were big electric users too. So I just, my checklist, I had an activation book. I just put X's through those pages and told Jack I'm skipping all of that and kept moving on. And it turned out, when we got back in the ground, Jim and I went into a limb simulator to Cape, and we repeated that power up rather, and we could not do it as fast as we had done it in flight. So it just has a little adrenaline helps.
Okay. So Gerry, we had Gene Kranz's team in Mission Control when the explosion happened, and a lot of Glenn Lunny's group was showing up because they were less than an hour from taking over. What was going on in Mission Control? What were they doing? And then kind of tell us how the people would have been responding to this. And then tell us when you got there and what you saw.
That's an excellent question, because I was going to make this point, kind of stepping back. You know, by the time we flew 13, we had been out to the moon 4 times, on 8, 10, 11, and 12. 2 of those we had landed. So we never took our eye off the systems and all of these things we had to watch to make sure that they stayed healthy. But we had gotten kind of used to going to the moon. At least we'd done it 4 times and got everybody back and didn't leave anybody up there. So we felt like, you know, we were beginning to get a feel of kind of the cadence and all that it took to go to the moon. To the point that I was on duty and Kranz relieved my team. His was the white team. The white team came in to relieve us. I went outside. This was a nice April, spring in Texas kind of day. And several of us did. And we were playing a softball game. And we had a team, the flight controllers had a team that we managed to scrape up enough people to play. We were just about started, and they came out and got me. I think they got some of the other guys. Ed Vindell, I remember, was one of them. And so I went back and said, you need to come back to the control center. We've had a problem. So I walked to my car, drove back to the control center, got out, walked in. I still had on my softball sweats. And I walked in. I noticed there were a few more people in the room, but it was calm. That, by the way, in the movie, I kept trying to get Ron Howard. I was a technical advisor for the movie. And so he had people walking all over the place. They actually had extras lined up. If you look, going back and forth across the control center. I said, we never did that, no matter how bad it got. And he said, Gerry, this is not a documentary. Which he had to tell me about 10 times during the filming. But the room was calm. There were more people in it. I remember walking in and Kranz was at his console, and Lunny, the black team, who was going to relieve him, had come in and was standing behind him. So I walked up and I said, yeah, well, what's going on? Or something like that. He said, well, something's happened and we've lost oxygen and we're losing the fuel cells. And by the way, for those of you who don't know it, fuel cell, you put oxygen and hydrogen in it, you get electrical power, and you also generate water, very nice water. You can drink it, use it for cooling, whatever you need. So we were losing our water supply as well. And about that time, Milt Wendler, who was the maroon team, had gotten wind of it. He had come in, and he had a new schedule, which says, and I'm listening this whole time, trying to catch up with where they've been. And Milt had created a new schedule, and I was to relieve Lunny, so I was only about 10 hours away from him. So I didn't stick around very long. I said, I'm going to at least go home, try to get some sleep. Couldn't sleep. Took a shower, got up and came back to the control center. And it was there for most of the next 3 days. It was a very disciplined chaos. It was trying to figure out what had happened. Nobody had ever thought about an oxygen tank exploding. And when it did, he got the oxygen tank next to it. That's what it really turned out. Or it either got the tank or it got the piping that went to it. And so we were losing both our oxygen tank. By the way, next mission had a third oxygen tank on the other side. That was one of the fixes. So it was a scramble there trying to, and once we got, this was the first mission that we had flown without having a free return. That a free return meant that if you didn't do anything with the trajectory, you go around the moon and you come back to Earth somewhere, not knowing exactly where that might be, but you at least get back to Earth. We had gone off the free return with a very small maneuver. Yeah, pretty soon after TLI and translunar injection. And that was for lighting purposes, and there was some other flight dynamics stuff in there that's why we did that. Well, the first thing we did was do a very small correction to get back on the free return. We later did a much larger maneuver when we went around the moon. It not only sped them up, it got them back into a good part of the ocean where we could get a carrier under them. Otherwise, we might have to pick them up with a destroyer or something, like we did on Gemini 8. So, what I want to get across is the training kicked in. That's why we were there. And although we didn't use the line in the real mission, the movie said something about this was NASA's finest hour. I think that was Ed Harris, who was playing a composite flight director of all four of us. That wasn't said, but as I look back on it, it probably was one of our finest hours. What we could do when faced with an almost impossible task.
If you would, Gerry, also, let's talk about, as you're coming back and you're looking at reentry, all those checklists go on, tell us what some of the unknowns were, some of the things that you were having to take into account. There's some things it's like, what does it matter? I mean, we've got to try it. But tell us some of the unknowns.
Well, the biggest unknown, we were still as we were coming back in the command module, came in the service module, we actually had the lunar module ascent stage still in tow. And so we were getting pretty close to Earth, still docked up with another spacecraft. And I remember when we finally had to kick them off, kick the lunar module off. They were all in the command module now, the crew. And it was kind of sad to see it go. It had gotten us home. And kind of sad. And that's when we also, shortly in that same time area, got rid of the service module. And that's when Jim, you saw the things that the whole side of that thing is blown out. The whole panel was missing. About a quarter of the roundness was gone. And you could see tanks and wiring, and tubes, and all kinds of things coming out of it. Wasn't a great picture, but there was a little bit of duress at the time. And these guys were trying to get ready to re-enter. I tell you, the most gripping time of the mission probably was that re-entry. Normally, as you come into the atmosphere, it gets so hot that you get this sheath of ions that is coming out of that plasma that's going across, and it blocks out all your communication. We call that blackout. We could time it to the second. We had two clocks, begin blackout, end blackout. And we could usually count right down to those times. They went into blackout right on time. And they came out, when the clock hit 0 on the end blackout, that was when Joe Kerwin was the Capcom, started calling, and called them about every 15 seconds, and no response. We had been worried in the back of our mind, never talked about not getting them back, but sure hope that explosion didn't do anything to the heat shield. Because if it did, if it cracked it or broke it somehow, they could burn up during the re-entry. It would just go right through it, burn the whole thing up. But we kept getting no answer, no answer, no answer. They didn't come out of blackout. Finally, and they were low altitude, Swigert calls them, "Hello, Houston, all 13 here, we're fine, doing just good." And all of us just kind of, staggered to the side. You could have heard a pin drop in the control center until Jack told us that they were okay. And everybody kind of got past that. And about that time is when we saw the chutes on one of our big screens that was taken from the carrier. And boy, those were the 3 prettiest chutes. They probably didn't look as pretty to us as they did to them. But it was awfully nice to see those 3 chutes out there in the command module down at the bottom.
One more thing about the command module. You have to appreciate the capsule that we shut down for 3.5 days. Literally, it froze. The water tanks froze in that vehicle. They were found still frozen when they recovered the capsule after entry, after splashdown, and got it on the aircraft carrier hangar deck and inspected it. The water tanks were still frozen. So we obviously, temperature-wise, had abused all those specifications on the electronics in that vehicle, about that margin. And yet the vehicle had come back to life as we went through that power up, and Jack got it. Jack was in charge. He was the command module pilot. Got a good alignment on platform up. Got a course alignment and a final alignment using star sightings. And we shed the command. The limit was not incidentally. We got to an attitude, yaw off our path a little bit, and kicked the limb off 45 minutes before we were going to hit the air. So that's when we got rid of the limb. But anyway, Jack got it back on the blunt end first to get back in entry. He let it stay in auto control with the computer through the entry. Obviously, he's looking at things that says if it's getting off course or whatever, he can take over control manually. But he let it fly auto all the way down. And after splashdown, as best they could mark that with the radar, If you looked at the final Apollo program report, there's an appendices that lists performance. And if you look at entries, our flight tied for second for the most accurate splashdown of the program. So I think those engineers over-designed the equipment. Thankfully.
Yes. Let's talk about the ALSET package and the little nuclear reactor in there that the Atomic Energy Commission was concerned about.
I can say it's a little something about it. Fred actually dealt with it, but that RTG that he called before, radio, thermo, something. I can't remember the last.
Nuclear.
But it's nuclear. It's a little nuclear power source that is still on the moon. And to get the permission to launch it was probably is a big problem as we had. We almost didn't get it. And that was true in all of the missions that had an ALSET, Apollo, scientific instrumentation package.
Now, I understand that based on their request, at least our entry point, because it was still in the limb, the RTG, we didn't have to get to deploy it. They insisted it be in a fairly deep part of the Pacific Ocean, and that kind of fixed the maneuver as we went around the moon. And by a couple of hours after we passed behind the backside, we did the longest maneuver we did using the landing engine on the limb. We used the landing engine on the limb that we're going to land with 3 times on our flight. But at first correction, he mentioned to get us back on at least a free return to get back toward Earth. In the Indian Ocean, I think, is where we'd hit. And then we did that burn after we passed the moon a couple hours, a very long burn, that put us back south of the Samoan Islands in the Pacific Ocean. So that made the nuclear folks happy that we're going to deposit that RTG in a very deep place with the limb. That would stay with the limb when it re-entered and came apart. That at least it would splash down and sink to the bottom in a deep part of the ocean.
Okay, now it's your turn. We have some questions in the audience.
Has the airman discovered the cause of the communication, the longer communications
The first contact that we normally had in those, we didn't have a tracking station out there. This was before we had tracking satellites, so you had to have ground coverage. So most of those early communications on entry came from an aircraft called the Orion, aircraft instrumentation, something. It's a big Connie airplane with an antenna, big one. And we normally talk to the crew through those. They were a little bit unreliable. They're subject to weather and to line of sight kind of stuff. And it was a little bit, it's a lot better today. You don't use those. So the only thing we can figure is that the airplane either was out of coverage, was out of position, or was out of configuration on some switch, which they had a bunch of. But they never did really pin it down, what caused that. And that's when they mentioned that on that documentary, Lovell said, well, we just didn't call because we thought it'd make a good movie. So he took total claim for it. But the real answer is, not real sure what caused it, but there were so many factors that it could have affected. It never did, except on 13. And wouldn't you know it, after we had an explosion back near the heat shield.
Anyone else? Okay. In the movie, they were transferring a lot of information. Was this right before re-entry? Is that what? Early on, okay. The alignment?
The alignment, okay.
Yeah, what was being done was normal. That was done when you activated the limb on all missions. Basically, you stole the aligned inertial platform angles, gimbal angles, what 3 readouts on a register on our CRT, if you will,